Tonight's topic is, did Akhenaten invent monotheism? This is one of the perennial things that people like to speculate about. Very famous ancient Egyptian pharaoh who created a religion that broke with the traditional religion of ancient Egypt, which had a lot of characteristics of later religions, some of which is sometimes posited that it is maybe monotheist and maybe the first monotheist religion. We'll look at all of that. Let's start out, though, by defining our theisms. And a lot of times when we talk about what we now kind of commonly term paganism or polytheism, we sometimes note that, in fact, all of these are sort of viewed with lenses of monotheists. And so really, it's monotheists who have been really obsessed with these theisms and defining actually other religions based on how much or how little they differ from their own central concern, which is believing that there is only one supreme God and that no other gods exist, and that only that God is worthy of worship. Worship is restricted to that God. And so even though monotheism is possibly is the last of these to develop, in a way I'm mentioning it first because nobody was calling any of these other forms of theism these terms until monotheism developed. That is, it's the monotheists who, like I say, have that consideration. The terms like monolatry and henotheism are relatively recent and modern terms. So polytheism, the traditional religions of the ancient world, included a belief in multiple gods and also worship of multiple gods. And that these were often very idiosyncratic. It was often very personal and related to your own family, your own place you grew up, your region. And even though a place like Egypt will have kind of create a pantheon that brings a lot of these together, and they would also maybe identify somebody's local cult with maybe syncretizing a couple gods and making them one, bringing them together into common myths and so forth. That wasn't necessarily the point for a lot of people. A lot of people it would have been, again, an intensely localized, idiosyncratic religion, polytheism. Monolatry continues to be people who believe that multiple gods exist, but they are promoting a religion that restricts worship to only one God. So nobody's denying that there are other gods, but for example, in the case of the Moabites, the king of the Moabites was saying the god of Moab, Chemosh, is our God and we only worship him. There are other gods like Yahweh that is over in Israel and so forth. The Edomites have a god, but we only worship the one God, monolatry. Henotheism believes that there are multiple gods, but among these there is a supreme God with a big G, the same way that monotheism has, or a supreme source of the divine that may be less personalized than sometimes it's thought of, and sometimes God is thought of in the Abrahamic religions, but that worship is not entirely restricted to that God. So in other words, even if there's only one divine source, one supreme God or one supreme divinity, all of the other divine beings can also be worshipped. And so sometimes, henotheism as an idea was sort of coined as Westerners started to study Indian religions and look at Hinduism. And in some cases, again, Hinduism has millions of gods, depending on how, the variation of it and the looking at it. But some Hindus understand Brahman or, there to be one kind of divine source of which the little g gods are emanations or expressions of. And, depending on how you count it, I mean, I've gone to some of the Hindu temples here in the Toronto area where the leaders of those temples say that no, we actually consider ourselves to be monotheists even though we identify God through little g gods as well. So in some cases, there is some possible semantic hair splitting between things like monotheism and henotheism, because honestly, many monotheists definitely leave room for the existence of heavenly beings such as angels or devils, jinn, and so forth, that fit somewhere between God and humans. And so the distinction, that these beings, which in some cases are kind of eternal or heavenly beings or from the underworld or beings kind of thing, that those are different than what, for henotheists are called gods with a little g. Like I say, that's a little bit of hair splitting, although one of the cases that the monotheists would say is really important about that is that only the supreme God is worthy of worship. And yet, again, what is the difference between worship and veneration? So it's completely possible in many Christian traditions, including the largest ones, the Catholic Church, for angels and saints to be able to be venerated. And so obviously venerated is different from worshipped in terms of the semantic point here. But in some ways, this is why, like I say, when you go to the different Hindu temples, they have different ideas about where they would be classified in this. But these are essentially the definitions that we have. So monotheism is there's only one God and all the other gods don't exist, and you're only to worship that one supreme God. Whereas henotheists acknowledge one divine source, but allow worship of other gods. And monolatry, again, acknowledges that there's all kinds of gods, but we were restricting worship to only one. So Akhenaten. So Akhenaten, a very famous pharaoh of ancient Egypt, came to the throne in the middle of the 14th century before the Common Era, which is part of the New Kingdom of Egypt, the 18th dynasty overall, and he's the 10th ruler of that dynasty. When he ascended the throne, his name was Amenhotep IV, and so he has a theophoric name about the god Amun instead of the god Aten. And once, though, he became pharaoh, he began to initiate religious reform and created what was effectively a new religion, or a very different variation that grew out of the previous traditional Egyptian religion, which many scholars call Atenism, or the worship of the Aten, or the Amarna heresy, it's sometimes called, as it's labeled as a negative thing by the mainline Egyptian religion, the traditional Egyptian religion. So as Atenism developed, Amenhotep changed his name to Akhenaten, which is now you can see as an Aten theophoric name. So he's got the name of God in his name, and that means that he is effective for the Aten. He is like the vessel that is effective for the Aten. And Akhenaten then built a new capital city of the Egyptian kingdom at a place called Amarna, which he named Akhetaten, which means horizon of the Aten. And unfortunately, once Atenism takes off, there's all these Aten theophoric names, and so it's going to be a lot complicated to talk about Akhenaten at Akhetaten, and so I'm going to continue to call Akhetaten Amarna, just to make it so you can tell I'm talking about the town or the city instead of the king, instead of the pharaoh. And as the religion developed, eventually he forbade the worship of Egypt's traditional gods. He dissolved their old priesthoods and defaced their temples and so forth. So is that monotheism, or was it more likely monolatry, as we've talked about it? So certainly excluding the worship of the other traditional gods. That's something that happens in monolatry, and ultimately prohibiting, for example, the use of idols, of worshiping through statues and images, was a very radical departure from the traditional religion of ancient Egypt. And ancient Egypt, of course, is one of the world's most conservative societies. You can look at all of the artwork and so on that doesn't come from the Amarna period from Akhenaten, where Egyptian artwork suddenly looks different, and otherwise it looks very, very similar. It's a little less, it seems like it's a little debased by the time you get down to the Ptolemies, the very end, the Hellenistic period under Ptolemies and down to Cleopatra. But nevertheless, it otherwise looks pretty similar, and it even continues to look traditional even then. Nevertheless, like I say, it's debated, and we'll talk about it tonight, whether Akhenaten's religion was fully monotheist. It was continuously evolving as he was going on in his reign, and by its final form, or maybe in his final mind, or whether, like I say, it represented a monolatry. In other words, he continued to recognize the existence of the other gods even as he forbade anybody from worshiping them, because of the worship of the Aten was so important. Ultimately, Atenism is short-lived. The traditional religion of Egypt was restored under Akhenaten's successors, and the subsequent ruling dynasty that came to power after the end of Akhenaten's dynasty ultimately sought to erase Akhenaten and Amarna from history. And so as a result of that, we don't have as much as we might to study Atenism. And nevertheless, a bunch of things have survived. This is one of the advantages, as we've always say about Egypt, is how easy it is to preserve everything. And so much is preserved in Egypt historically, even when the subsequent pharaohs go through a lot of effort and try to erase all of their predecessors from history. Traces have survived in other places, and we find it. And one of those is because this special capital city, Amarna, was built and then abandoned. Lots of things were preserved there because they were not the place was not reused. And so one of those things is a great hymn to the Aten, and that is to say to Akhenaten's god, which is the sun, or the disk of the sun. And so that hymn poem begins, "You rise beautiful from the horizon on heaven, O living disk, O Aten, origin of life. You are risen from the horizon, you've filled every land with your beauty. You are fine, great, radiant, lofty over and above every land. Your rays bind the lands to the limit of all you have made. You are the Ra, you are the sun. You have reached their limits. You bind their limits for your beloved son, for Akhenaten. You are distant, but your rays are on earth. You are in the sight, but your movements are hidden. You rest in the western horizon." So the sun rises in the east, sets in the west, and the land is in darkness, in the manner of death when the sun goes down. Sleepers in chambers, head covered, no eye can see its other. Anything of theirs can be taken from under their heads. They would not know, because without the Aten, all is in darkness. And so in addition to being expressed in the disk of the sun, as the sun, which gives light and heat to the land, and indeed all lands, Aten is understood in this hymn as a source of general fertility for the world. And so, for example, when we read, "When the chick in the egg speaks in its shell, you give it breath within to cause it to live. You have made him. He is complete to break out from the egg, and he emerges from the egg to speak to his completion, and he walks on his legs, going out from it. So in addition to all of the animals like chickens, Aten also turns seed into people, and so is the cause for human babies as well as animals. So fertility is one of the most important functions of the gods in traditional societies, and that function in Atenism is understood to be a function that Aten provides. How numerous are your works, the hymn continues, though hidden from sight, unique God, there is none beside him. You mold the earth to your wish, you and you alone. All people, herds and flocks, all on earth that walk on legs, all on high that fly with their wings, and all the foreign lands of Kar, Syria, to the north of Egypt, and Cush, Nubia, to the south of Egypt, and the land of Egypt. You place every man in his place. You make whatever they need, so that everyone has food, his lifespan counted. So the hymn's praise here of the Aten as the unique God, or God, we make this distinction. There isn't a separate word here, but we make a distinction between the supreme God or maybe just the chief God or the most important God. And declaring that there is none beside you, those are arguments that perhaps Atenism is monotheist. Nevertheless, one of the problems with that maybe is that Akhenaten himself has a very exalted role and is, sort of worshipped as a god on earth. So part of the religion is that the people focus their attention on the Aten's unique son on earth, Akhenaten, and then Akhenaten worships the Aten for the people. And so the hymn talks about Akhenaten as we continue. You are in my heart. There is none other who knows you besides your son, Nefertiti. Don't know Egyptian, so I'm going to always ruin all of these names. So the pharaohs of Egypt have multiple different royal names, and so we usually know them by their most famous regnal name, like Akhenaten, but they also have like a praenomen and other names, and Akhenaten's praenomen translates as unique one of Ra. So Ra means the sun. Ra is also a god, but again, this is one of the complexities that you have as you are moving from a traditional polytheist society to emphasizing only one god. You still end up using a lot of the names of other gods who are things like the sun. So you instruct him, that is, you instruct Aten, God, in your plans and in your strength. The land comes into being by your action as you make them, and when you have shown they live, and when you rest, they die. You are lifetime in your body, people live by you. Eyes are on your beauty until you set. All work is stopped when you set in the west. Shine and strengthen all for the king. Motion is in every leg since you founded the earth. You raise them for your son, who come from your body, the king who lives on right, Lord of the two lands, Nefertiti, I'm saying it again, Nefertiti, I'll say. Unique one of Ra, so in other words, the praenomen of Akhenaten. The son of Ra who lives on the right, the Lord of risings, Akhenaten, great in his lifespan, and the king's great wife, whom he loves, the lady of the two lands, Nefertiti, eternally alive. So Nefertiti here is the king's great wife, and so she is also part of the Atenism and all of its imagery. And so usually, sometimes it's just Akhenaten who's seen worshiping the Aten. Sometimes it's him with Nefertiti, his wife, his great wife. He will have had other concubines and lesser wives. And then also often they're pictured with some of their 6 daughters. So Egypt's 19th dynasty, the one after Akhenaten, the Ramessids, who took power after Akhenaten's line, like I say, nearly erased him from history. So the forgotten pharaoh and his religion were really only rediscovered after archaeological excavation began at this abandoned capital, Akhetaten, now called Amarna, during the 19th century. So the discovery of the existence of a religious reformer in Egypt that, seems to be sort of monotheistic, there's something at least monolatrous, it sort of has this, caused a lot of people in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries to either look for or to assume, to imagine, to wish that there is a connection between this reform and the origins of Israelite or First Temple Judaism, monotheism. And this is especially true given the biblical story of the Exodus, and also because of coincidences, or because of anyway the way it matches up to traditional dates that had always been kind of given to the character of Moses in the Exodus story. And so here's one of our timelines. If we look at the vast and lengthy history of ancient Egypt, my dating here is from 4000 before the Common Era down to the year 1 before the Common Era. Egyptian history proper sort of begins as long ago as 3150 before the Common Era, when Upper and Lower Egypt are first united in what's called the early dynastic period. This is also in that early period when hieroglyphics are developed. And finally, we get to traditional date here, or the calculation anyway, here of 2686 BCE and the beginning of the Old Kingdom, which is where things like the pyramids all date from, including the first pyramids and the Great Pyramids of Giza, still 2500 BC, so very much before all of this time when we're getting to the New Kingdom. The kingdoms are separated by intermediate periods as the central state collapses for various reasons and is then refounded. And so after the Old Kingdom, an intermediate period is the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom collapses, and at that point there are invaders who rule the Lower Egypt, which is in the north, the Delta, Semitic peoples, presumably the Hyksos, who are ruling there, and peoples from Kush, from Nubia, are ruling in the south. But eventually, a dynasty from the center is able to expel both invaders and reconstitute a native Egyptian kingdom, the New Kingdom, which is sort of this kind of great period that we think of as Egypt, although it's not the pyramid part, but it's where lots and lots of the most famous Egyptian pharaohs that we think of are from, including Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, King Tut, Ramesses the Great, and also the famous Hatshepsut, who is the woman pharaoh, the most famous of the women who rule as pharaoh. After the New Kingdom collapses, Egypt has a bunch of time periods where it's not all unified, and also it faces a bunch of foreign conquerors. So Nubians, Assyrians, the Persians, and ultimately Alexander. And then after Alexander's conquest in the 4th century before the Common Era, his general Ptolemy sets up a kingdom there from a new capital of Alexandria, and the last 300 years of the Egyptian state before the Romans take it over as the period of the Ptolemies, where we have things like Alexandria with its lighthouse and library and so on. So if we have that kind of broad, vast sweep of Egyptian history to kind of orient ourselves, can see we're in the beginning and middle of the New Kingdom kind of period. And if we then look at the kind of traditional dates, or some of the traditional dates for some biblical things, the Babylonian exile, so that is the time period after the first temple in Jerusalem is destroyed, and while the Judean elite are in exile in Babylon, before the Persians conquer the Babylonian Empire and allow them to go back and rebuild a second temple under Persian dominion. That's when the beginnings of kind of the time period for compiling of the Bible, and certainly to get to be the books like the book of Exodus in the present form that we have, are sort of in that kind of time range and beyond even. And then as the rabbis later are kind of looking back and trying to assign dates to things that are happening in the books of Genesis and Exodus, the rabbinic date for Eden is about 3700 BCE. The flood would have been taking place if there had been a universal flood. It actually, we know from Egyptian history that the rabbinic dates won't work because there is a old kingdom of Egypt that is continuously operating through that whole time period. But interestingly, the rabbinic dates for Moses, as a major character in the Exodus story, he kind of lines up with right around this time period, especially with Ramesses, but also in terms of the rabbinic dates with Akhenaten, since Moses is a long-lived figure in the Bible. So it is kind of interesting, that traditional dates, these are not dates, there are no dates in the Exodus story. This is dates that hundreds of years later, the rabbis calculated and assigned that. And there's also Christians were also creating dates. And so these dates are not the same for everybody's. These aren't the same as Bishop Ussher's scale, but I just put these on for reference. So like I say, once Atenism was discovered, once this hitherto unknown Pharaoh Akhenaten was discovered by archaeologists and Egyptologists at the end of the 19th century, and in the early 20th century, people were very interested in this. And one of the very first people who took a popular stance on this was actually Sigmund Freud, of all things. So the very last book that he published, Moses and Monotheism, which is said to have been written on his deathbed, Freud advanced a theory working with the assumption that Moses was a historical figure, that he was not in fact a Hebrew slave, as the Exodus story says, but instead was a renegade Egyptian priest, a priest of Akhenaten. According to Freud in Moses and Monotheism, in Freud's telling of the story, Moses escaped Egypt with only a small group of followers after Akhenaten's death. And these followers made their way to Midian in, not Sinai, but in kind of Western Arabia, where they end up killing Moses, this Egyptian priest. They merge with this Midianite tribe and in fact become absorbed into the Midianite tribe, and this group is the proto-Israelites. Those Midianites, by coincidence, also happened to be monotheists. They worshipped a god Yahweh, who Freud said was a volcano god. So he takes the story of Moses, going to Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, and when God is present on it, according to the Exodus story, a fiery cloud hovers over the mountain. Freud looks for a naturalistic explanation of that and suggests that, okay, well, this is not a mountain in the Sinai Peninsula because there are no volcanoes there, but is a volcano in Western Arabia. And so Yahweh is a volcano god. And as a result of this combination of Atenist Egyptians and Midianite volcano worshippers, a composite religion was created where Atenism and Yahwism got fused together, and the Yahweh name is the one that survived. So Freud said that this group, which are the Proto-Israelites that become the Israelites, later ended up ascribing the deeds of that Egyptian Moses that they had murdered to a Midianite priest who also came to be called Moses. And thus, the biblical character is actually a composite, according to Freud's reconstruction of this repressed history. So Freud suggested that then he went on to go on and say, well, now all of the people Jewish psyche have ever since then been having a repressed collective guilt over this murder of one of their co-founders, the Egyptian Moses, and that was passed down in the psyche. And so I think that probably is just as good a psychology as it is history, which is not history at all. So there's no historical evidence for any of this. This is not done. This speculation is done without any historical methodology. It's a kind of pop history, and I think it reads the way that many people would like history to work. So people would like to take the limited number of names that we know from history and also different mythic stories that survive from the past in order to spin out what I think are essentially fantasies, creating what are total fictions as this reconstruction that Freud had. So nevertheless, Freud is not the first, or certainly not the last person to want to connect Atenism with the development of Israelite monotheism, and a lot of people want to have that via Moses somehow because of that's giving you your transmission corridor for it. So what else have people looked at? Well, a number of scholars, including an Egyptologist in the beginning of the 20th century, James Henry Breasted, and also, for example, lay theologian C.S. Lewis, who's popular not only for his Narnia fantasy series, but also as a Christian writer and popularizer of things. They took a look at that great hymn to the Aten that I was quoting and compared it with several of the Psalms in the Hebrew Bible, including especially Psalm 104, which is a psalm that is praising Yahweh as a creator of the world and everything in it, all of the cosmos, the living things, including the sun in its course, and so on. And so the psalm reads, "Lord my God, Yahweh, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty. The Lord wraps himself in light as with a garment. He stretches out the heavens like a tent. He lays the beams of his upper chambers on their waters." If we look at kind of some side-by-side passages, the psalm says, "You bring darkness, O Lord, it becomes night, and all the beasts of the forest prowl. The lions roar for their prey, and they seek their food from God. The sun rises and they steal away. They return and lie down in their dens." In the great hymn to the Aten, he says, "Aten, whenever you set on the western horizon, the land is in darkness in the manner of death. Every lion comes out of his cave, and all the serpents bite, for darkness is a blanket. The land is silent now because he who made them is at rest on the horizon." Psalm 104 says, "There is the sea, vast and spacious, teeming with creatures beyond number, living things both large and small. There are ships, there the ships go to and fro, and Leviathan, the great monster of chaos, which you formed to frolic there." So God has created all of the different sea creatures and that are filling the oceans. The boats are there as well. The great hymn to the Aten says, "The barges sail upstream and downstream too. For every way is open at your rising, O Aten. The fishes in the river leap before your face when your rays are in the sea." Another one here is, "How many are your works, O Lord, O Yahweh? In wisdom you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures." And the Aten hymn says, "How plentiful it is what you have made, although they are hidden from view, sole God." So there's some similar themes and parallels here. This is, like I say, been pointed out by lots and lots of scholars, from early Egyptologists to Christian thinkers like C.S. Lewis. Nevertheless, none of these is a quotation. So it's not that Psalm 104, the writer of that, has a copy of the great hymn to Aten or anything like that, or has just updated it or something. There's no direct literary relationship between the great hymn to Aten or the Hebrew Psalms that are praising Yahweh. And you can imagine that if you are envisioning a supreme God who is a creator of everything, and you have kind of an ancient Middle Eastern view of the cosmos, and you start describing all the things that are going on in it, it could be somewhat similar. There are possibilities also that that Egyptian hymns may have exercised some influence on psalms and so forth in general, without it having to have anything to do with Atenism. So in other words, this is not necessarily showing that there's any kind of transmission or vector, just an interesting similarity. So I want to look at historical context of Akhenaten as we explore any possible connections. So as I mentioned, this is set in the New Kingdom period of Egypt, which occurred following a period of foreign rule over Lower Egypt. And when we look at a map here, so Egypt is centered, of course, on the Nile. And so it's a long, thin, squiggly line that is going all the way down to what's labeled here Kush, Nubia, essentially the Sudan. And then all the way up to the delta, where it becomes larger as the river splits up as it heads towards the Mediterranean Sea. And universally, in modern times, we draw maps with north at the top and south at the bottom. And since we orient ourselves that way, we tend to think of, something that's upper as being up above things on a map, and lower as being lower on the map. But that is not what anybody in ancient times would think, because maps weren't oriented that way if they had maps. We use the word orient because the majority of maps were actually oriented based on the east. Orient is Latin for east. And that is because, of course, the sun rises in the east. And so Roman maps, for example, were oriented east most of the time. So, and same thing, early Christian maps. So as a result, Lower Egypt is northern Egypt because the water of the Nile is going downhill. It begins in the mountains in the south, which are up higher, and the water flows down the hill, flows down towards the sea where it is lower. And so Lower Egypt is lower in terms of elevation. That's the northern part. So the Hyksos, so foreign people from the Levant, were ruling, had been in the intermediate period, had been ruling in the Delta, and Nubians from Kush, from the Sudan, had been ruling in the south. And so then a native Egyptian dynasty based in Thebes, which is right kind of in the middle, successfully expelled the foreigners in the middle of the 16th century before the Common Era and established the New Kingdom. And that kingdom then brought ancient Egypt to its height. And so we can see it expanded in the New Kingdom period to be kind of an empire where the Egyptians exercised control over Canaan and Syria. So they then were in contact with the Hittites, Mitanni, Babylonia, and so they were often having to fight against the Mitanni or the Hittites, and they often did that in Syria at places like Kadesh. So the New Kingdom is our setting. The imperial capital, Thebes, like I say, was in the middle. Pharaohs of the 18th dynasty attributed their success to the Theban god Amun, and so therefore many of these pharaohs have Amun names, Amun theophoric names, like Amenhotep, which means Amun is satisfied. All of these gods and their cults had priests, and the priesthood of Amun at Thebes became incredibly powerful officials at this time. And indeed, after the interlude of Atenism, when the priesthood is restored, the priests of Amun become more and more powerful until they become effective rulers over parts of Egypt later, when the pharaohs go into decline. So I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see this chart, but this is essentially within the New Kingdom, the 17th dynasty going to the 18th dynasty. And so we can see pharaohs like Moses I, who is the pharaoh who defeats the Hyksos and conquers their capital of Aris, which is in the delta. And then you can see down his two generations later, is Thutmose I, who expands the empire to its greatest extent, subjugating much of Nubia and Syria. And then that continues down. So by his primary wife, that Pharaoh Thutmose had a daughter, Hatshepsut, who marries her half-brother Thutmose II, who is her father's son by a lesser wife. So Thutmose's reign was uneventful and was likely dominated by Hatshepsut, and ultimately he died, leaving a 2-year-old son by a lesser wife as Thutmose III. So Hatshepsut had not borne any sons, and so this becomes the very famous female pharaoh, a queen regnant. She assumes the throne as co-ruler with her infant nephew/stepson Thutmose III, and Hatshepsut is often portrayed using the iconography associated with male pharaohs, including, as you can see this picture of her, the beard. But of course, all of the pharaohs wore these very decorative false beards as a symbol of royalty. It's like one of their other symbols, like the crown, the different objects that they're holding. These are parts of their symbology, just the same way that the King of England has his crown and so forth. So Hatshepsut has a very long and successful reign, including expanding of trade in Punt and also massive construction projects throughout Upper and Lower Egypt. So just mention it because we have one of these other very famous Egyptian figures not too many generations before we get to Akhenaten. And it's interesting within this thousands of years of the scope of Egyptian history, how many really famous ones there are kind of in a quick succession. So Hatshepsut had the support of these important Theban priests, these priests of Amun. And so, for example, we have an oracle written here which proclaimed it was the god's will that she reign as pharaoh. So that's Amun says, "Welcome, my sweet daughter, my favorite, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Matkare Hatshepsut. Thou art the pharaoh, taking possession of the two lands." So Amun blesses her. So in other words, there's an alliance between the royal house and this very powerful priesthood in the capital. Nevertheless, after Hatshepsut's death, her co-ruler, which is this Thutmose III, who was her stepson/nephew, he'd had to essentially be, probably had no power. He's just a pharaoh in name only until she died. And then now he is, an adult. He's able to rule in his own right for another 34 years. He probably resented his stepmother's earlier dominance. And so by the end of his reign, he began deleting her name and images from monuments that she had built. And he almost succeeded, therefore, in erasing her from history, despite what an incredible builder she was. And so we can have, this is an example of a place that had Hatshepsut's image, and that has been erased. It's one of the, as a kid, one of my favorite old movies like this, a period piece movie about Egypt, is the Ten Commandments, one of these cast of thousands, Cecil B. DeMille classics. And when the pharaoh Seti is exiling Prince Moses after Moses had built this special treasure city and had his name carved on all the pylons, Seti says, "Let the name Moses be stricken from every pylon." And so striking the names of pharaohs is something that later pharaohs were doing here in the New Kingdom. And so it is, that's meant as, in the movie, it's meant as an apologetic. Why don't we see the name Moses anywhere if Moses had actually been a prince of Egypt? So it's a modern apologetic explanation built into the movie. So Thutmose III was followed by his son, Thutmose IV, who then was followed by his son, Amenhotep III. Again, he has one of these Amen theophoric names, which means Amun is satisfied. The Thutmoses have Thoth, the god Thoth, theophoric names. So under Amenhotep III, Egypt, like I say, ancient Egypt reached its peak in prosperity, artistic style, international prestige, and his long reign was celebrated with special jubilees during his 30th year, his 34th, his 37th. And across the river from Thebes, he built a new palace city at Malkata, as was part of this Jubilee celebration that he was doing, these said festivals, as they're called. And so if you kind of see the map here, if you can see Thebes in the middle, Malkata, this place where there's a new palace temple complex, is across the river from Thebes. So it's possible that Amenhotep III was already reacting to the growth and the power of the priest of Amun, and he therefore revived these festivals in order to focus more religious attention on or to have more religious attention on the pharaoh itself, so that the king now is being more of a religious focus rather than the priesthood. In any event, we don't know, but in any event, he built a new Jubilee Palace complex, like I say, across from Thebes in order to celebrate these massive festivals that included huge parties, lots of food, lots of drink, and so forth. During the central ceremony, the pharaoh is drawn across the Nile in boats that are modeled on the idea of Ra, the sun, which is supposedly he's on a barge or a boat as he goes across the sky, and that's the disk of the sun that is above the god Ra, who is riding on the barge. And so the pharaoh is now mimicking that same thing that the sun does, and so he's equating himself essentially with Ra, the sun god, as he's having one of these jubilees, as he is celebrating his deification as a god himself. And so Amenhotep III, according to his understanding of the said festival, is is renewing himself and being reborn as a living god. So although he was a god, he nevertheless did die physically. He doesn't become immortal, and was succeeded by his young son, Amenhotep IV. It's not entirely clear when he died. He might have ruled on together with him for a while, but the new pharaoh, Amenhotep IV, celebrated a jubilee well before he had his 30th year in reign. And so in other words, he has one of these festivals like his father had done, and so maybe it's showing ongoing continuity with his father's reign if his father had died, or maybe his father is still alive and they're celebrating that together, something like that. In any event, it's probably that he's indicating ongoing continuity with his father's reign as an eternal living god. But this new Amenhotep IV, this is the pharaoh who is about to change his name to Akhenaten. So this is our character. And you can see the association that his father and he have had already with the sun god, with Ra. However much Amenhotep IV had inherited from his father's solar deification, he quickly took things a lot further and changed his religion as a religious revolution. So the sun god Ra supports the solar disk, and the solar disk is the Aten. And so Amenhotep, as he still was, begins to erect temples to the Aten alongside those of traditional gods in Thebes. So there's temples to Amun, there's temples to Ra. Now there's special temples to the Aten, to the solar disk. But beginning in the 5th year of his reign, the Amenhotep IV disbands the competing priesthoods and officially changes his own name to Akhenaten, this name that means effective for the Aten. So now his focus is going to be on the Aten, the solar disk, his understanding of the god of Egypt. So the Aten, like I say, is the physical manifestation of the solar disk. It's originally seen as an aspect of the sun god Ra, but Akhenaten starts to, cease to think of Ra as previously represented, and his focus is really on the sun itself, and also now as seeing that as the supreme god of Egypt, reborn each day. We had talked about how incredibly conservative Egyptian art had been. Suddenly now, a new style of art that diverges very strongly from other Egyptian art is commissioned, and this you can see is kind of a lot of cases focused on the solar disk and its rays, and human forms that look very different from the traditional staid, kind of perfect Egyptian way that Egyptians had previously always and later always depicted figures. Each of the rays in these is shown bestowing ankhs, which is an Egyptian symbol of divine life, and also other gifts. And so you can see in a close-up picture here on the left, at the end of the rays, they have a little hands, and they're holding these ankhs. So the sun rays are giving these ankhs, divine gifts, to Akhenaten and his family as they worship the Aten. So Akhenaten's father had equated himself with the sun in life, and Akhenaten now considered himself to be the son of the Aten. So in all of these representations then, he's presented as timeless. He's now entered the divine present in the time frame of gods. Like I say, he himself is the Aten's living expression, the Akhenaten, the divine intermediary between the supreme god and the realm of mortals. So the people of Egypt are not to be worshiping all of these other gods anymore. They're to turn their worship to Akhenaten and his family, and Akhenaten then is worshiping on their behalf the Aten, the supreme god. One of the things that he now does is takes the incredible wealth of the new kingdom in order to have a massive building project. And so downriver from Thebes, between Thebes and Memphis, he makes a new capital, Akhetaten, in what we now call Amarna. And that capital, of course, has an Aten theophoric name, which means the horizon of Aten. The move would obviously have been a huge blow to the old capital and also to the power of the priesthood of Amun that has been disbanded. So in the old capital, there was, would have been all laid out with all of the existing previous gods' temples and so forth. It's the same essentially as when you, move away in the Christianized Roman Empire from the old Rome that is laid out with all of the historic temples to the traditional gods, and you now focus on a new capital, a new Rome, Constantinople, which does have some temples built into it when it starts, some pagan temples, but can become focused on the great churches, ultimately Hagia Sophia and so forth. So the changes also, might have shocked a bunch of the Egyptian economy. There would have been a big change to focus this much attention on founding his new religion. The city of Amarna is designed entirely for solar worship. So its focal point is the new royal tomb in the east, which is again where the sun rises each morning. And as the Aten's living spirit, Akhenaten would then process east to west, just like the sun in his morning commute, making each day, a solar religious festival. And so it's a daily worship as you are focusing on the sun as the expression of the supreme god. This is just the artist's reconstruction of how the new capital would be, with a processional road and looking from the Nile bank to the east where the sun rises. So, like I say, also Akhenaten initiated an artistic revolution, which I think you can kind of say portrays him in a very unflattering way. Sometimes people have called it grotesque. So he no longer looks like these, very staid Egyptian, it's like, Egyptian god style, muscle guys. It's different from, it's more like archaic Greek statues than the later ones that have a lot of realism because they're very formalized Egyptian art. And for a whole long time, people theorized that this really crazy change in the artwork was going from something that was very non-realistic, traditional Egyptian art, to something that potentially was very realistic. And so the theory had been that, well, maybe Akhenaten is, a very weird-looking guy who also suffered from lots of illnesses, and a lot of speculation went down that path. However, especially since a mummy that seems likely to be Akhenaten has now been identified and has been genetically tested, which does not have any of these kinds of deformities or problems. This is now seen, the artwork is now seen probably as being reflecting the religion, not realism. In other words, that there's a religious purpose that Akhenaten is being portrayed this way. And so rather than having it be a realism because of some genetic disease, there's a theological purpose that is being represented here. And that makes a lot of sense considering how focused everything Akhenaten did is on religion. And so what might that be? Well, in the traditional Egyptian religion, there were understood to be 8 deities at the beginning as part of the creation story. And these differentiated 4 male and 4 female, and that differentiation is part of what began creation. So these come to be worshipped in the Egyptian city of Hermopolis. By the time that they are depicted in the Roman era, they look like this. So there will be 4 male deities, 4 female. The male ones are depicted as having the heads of frogs, and the female ones are depicted as having the heads of snakes. And of course, when you're having an idea of creation and change, frogs, of course, being amphibians, change from tadpoles into frogs, so they're an animal that represents that. Snakes, because they shed their skins and renew themselves, are also associated with change in that way, and sometimes immortality. And so together they form, the 8-fold deities, the Ogdoad. And so images of Akhenaten and his wife, Nefertiti, and their 6 daughters may be portraying the family as a new Ogdoad. That is to say, they are the primordial deities that are displacing the old ones in the Egyptian religion, as Atenism is displacing the traditional religion. And it's possible that the goal of the new portraiture, which is showing, just has a very ambiguous gender, so both Akhenaten and Nefertiti have male and female characteristics. And so maybe this is meant to show a primordial couple which is both male and female. In other words, before a division that the world comes into. So they're pre-existing at a time before there's this differentiation between gender, light and dark, heaven and earth, and so forth. It's a sign of the divinity as understood in Atenism. So again, we have before Atenism causes this artistic revolution, we have this famous bust of Nefertiti in the kind of traditional style, and then we have the later kind of portrayals of her and Akhenaten with the Aten itself, with all the rays that end in the little hands with their ankhs. And then we also have, in this case, 3 of the daughters portrayed. In some cases they have 6. There's 6 daughters forming this family that the people turn their worship to as they worship the sun, the supreme god. So Queen Nefertiti is one of the other really famous individuals. That bust here is very well known. I have known it anyway for a whole long time. And she is, like I say, often paired with Akhenaten. She has the title Great Royal Wife, which is one of the chief wife of the pharaoh. And like I say, she's perhaps representing this primordial moment of creation, and they tend to be surrounded by these princesses who also then have ambiguous looking gender, looks very strange, and so forth. So by focusing on the primordial, by focusing on the supreme creator existing in an eternal, timeless state prior to the differentiation of the divine into lesser gods, Akhenaten effectively declared all of these later lesser gods to be irrelevant. And so in the same way that his own, or that Hatshepsut's name was stricken by her successor, and Akhenaten's own name is going to be stricken by later successors, he commands that the names of the different lesser gods are defaced. And so this is a relief of the great god Amun in his temple in Thebes, which has been defaced by the orders of Akhenaten. So the cults of these other gods, the traditional religion of Egypt, are persecuted, the names erased, the temples closed, festivals and rites banned, the priests dispersed, and so on. So it is a big revolution, and depending on how we look at it, I mean, it's presumably Akhenaten. It's hard to decide. You have to think about the people's motivations. A lot of times we're skeptical of religious motivations. A lot of times people are very fervent in their real religious belief and commitment. So he may well have had that, but people have also argued, well, there's also a political factor. So as you have previously had to share power with incredibly powerful priesthoods, one of the things you can do by eliminating them and by assuming all the religious control yourself is potentially take all that power and bring it into the monarchy instead of sharing it with powerful priests. Be that as it may, no matter how much in Akhenaten's mind the Aten maybe was not just the supreme god, but maybe the only god. So whether it actually did get to monotheism from monolatry, and I'm not thinking that it did. Nevertheless, it's easier to, as Pharaoh, ban everything and make the orders that people aren't allowed to believe in the old gods and follow the old religions than to actually have them do it. Because even now that it's been much more widely excavated at the capital, Akhetaten, at Amarna, just huge numbers of objects have been found. For example, little depictions of Bes. So Bes is a little dwarf goddess who wards off evil spirits, and so the common people were still holding on to these, even in the new capital where you're not supposed to have those. You'll find bunches of them for Tiwaret. So Tiwaret is this kind of goddess who protects childbirth, and you can imagine that no matter how much you've been told about the Aten and how the Aten is causing all the childbirth and things like that, if you'd been growing up under the protection of Tiwaret and you are going to give birth, it's hard to want to give up, hard to want to turn away from a god who might cause you to lose a child and so forth. And so those are also found even in the new capital. So no matter how much the pharaoh might have wanted to impose Atenism, it takes a long time for that to happen, usually generations. And so even in the workers' camps, as they're building the new Aten complexes, workers are remaining loyal in some cases to their beliefs that they grew up with. Although Akhenaten had a divine role in his religion, he's the unique son of Aten, nevertheless, he did die at some point. So Egypt is stricken with a plague, big epidemic of some kind during the end of his reign. That is also not a good sign when you're starting a new religion if you, either coincidentally or because the gods are mad at you, there's a big plague that doesn't look good for people. And it does seem that members of the royal family, some of those daughters may have died, maybe Akhenaten, so as a result of this. In any event, because the reigns of this dynasty, this part of the dynasty, were later stricken from the record, evidence for the succession order isn't clear. But one possibility is that Queen Nefertiti assumed the throne as pharaoh herself with the new name, regnal name, as Pharaoh Pharaoh. And so it's possible, and we have depictions, for example, of Nefertiti here, in kind of a male form, and subjecting her enemies in that particular depiction. So it's possible that she becomes the queen regnant. Another possibility is that this pharaoh, this queen regnant, Nefertiti, Pharaohaten, I think I have too many syllables there in that one. Anyway, it's also possible that that's the regnal name of the eldest of the 6 daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. So Meritaten, So one of these 6 princesses, she maybe has grown up and she assumes she becomes a queen regnant. It's possible because then she may have been the wife of Smenkhare, who also seems to have ruled briefly as a male pharaoh, and so he may have either been a younger brother of Akhenaten or an older son of Akhenaten. And so this picture here of a young pharaoh in the Amarna style may be Smenkhare. And so in any event, what exactly happened, all of these pharaohs here, Smenkhare and Nefertiti, they are short-lived, and they eventually are succeeded by a new child king, Tutankhamun. So if the mummy that's been found and has been correctly identified as Akhenaten, genetic tests show that that mummy is Tutankhamun's father, and it would be he would be the son by a lesser consort than Nefertiti. So there's the Nefertiti with the 6 daughters. Maybe this guy Smenkhare would be his older half brother or something like that, or maybe it's his uncle. If we've found the mummy and if it's been for Akhenaten, and we do see that Tutankhamun is Akhenaten's son, he's not depicted in all of those images that show Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters. And that may be because Akhenaten, for him having a son, implied that he might not be immortal, and he might he might eventually die like he did, and the kingdom would be passed to this son. It's not entirely clear, but it's most likely scenario, I guess, is that Tutankhamun is actually his son. He's pictured here with his half-sister and wife, Akhetaten. And so this is also one of those six daughters. And so Tutankhamun means living image of the Aten. Nevertheless, a succession of short-lived pharaohs and then also pharaohs that are children is always a problem for a monarchy, especially a monarchy that has gone through this big revolution that is the force of will of a very strong pharaoh who also is potentially fighting groups have other power bases like priesthoods. And so at this point, as the dynasty is wobbling, pressure to end the persecution of the old religion, to allow worship of the old gods, must have become kind of enormous. And so after Akhenaten's death, like I say, the dynasty was sort of tottering during his young son Tutankhamun's minority. And so early on in the reign of this child king, the government abandons the new capital, Amarna, and moves back to one of the previous capitals, Memphis, which is located more between Upper and Lower Egypt. And so the young pharaoh, or his government in his name, restored the old religion. And when they did that, they had the pharaoh reject ultimately his Aten name and adopt an Amun name. So he becomes the famous Tutankhamun, which means the living image of Amen. And so his queen, Akhetaten, which meant she lives in the Aten, again, the third of those 6 daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, she also sheds her Aten name for an Amun name, and so she becomes Amun. Another, her life is Amun instead of the Aten. So, nevertheless, this king, Tutankhamun, dies unexpectedly at the age of 18. So you can see the dynasty is not doing well. Although he has now become one of the most famous pharaohs in modern times, King Tut. This is largely because he was so forgotten in antiquity that his tomb, alone out of all of the tombs of Egypt's kings, was left unrobbed and was discovered in 1922 with all of the treasures intact, which is all the treasures, famous treasures of King Tut. So, like I say, he died unexpectedly and very young, and he was succeeded by a new pharaoh named A. A had been his vizier, his chief minister, and he had also been vizier under Akhenaten. People have suggested that A may have actually been the father of Nefertiti. He's probably some kind of part of the family, although not in the main line. And it's maybe again hard to read these kind of signs here, but you can see here Amenhotep III, his son Akhenaten, his wife Nefertiti, and then his son Tutankhamun, and now A here is maybe, on the chart anyway, is being shown here as Nefertiti's dad, and then his son-in-law is his successor, Horemheb. So A also doesn't reign for more than 4 years or so, and he's then succeeded by Horemheb, the commander of the army. It's been suggested that he's A's son-in-law, but other than that, he really has no familial ties to the rest of the dynasty. And so because he himself doesn't produce a son and heir, he represents the end of this dynasty. He brings some stability back after this period of instability, rules for about 14 years, during which time he sent workers back to the old Atenist capital, Amarna, demolished all the buildings, started reusing all of the rubble and stones and everything for his own projects. And he also began a process of taking everything that had been built in Tutankhamun's name and also in A's name. He erased their carvings and names and so forth and started relabeling them as his own. So, like I say, he didn't have an heir, and so he's succeeded by his own vizier. That person reigned as Ramesses I, and Ramesses I becomes the founder of a new dynasty, the 19th dynasty, the Ramessid dynasty, probably becomes a very famous one because of Ramesses I, who's succeeded by Seti I, who's succeeded by Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great. And so Ramesses the Great is portrayed here in the colossi at the Great Temple of Abu Simbel, and there's all sorts of other, he's a great builder, and so there's lots of other Ramesses statues. He's the same king that is named from the Ozymandias poem, and he is almost always the king who is portrayed as the pharaoh in the Exodus story. The Ramessids, that dynasty, continued what Horemheb had began. So Horemheb started deleting Akhenaten and his family from the king lists, relabeling their monuments as his monuments, striking any instances of their names. And so now when they made the new king lists at the Ramessid dynasty, Horemheb was said to have succeeded directly from Amenhotep III. So Akhenaten's father went straight to Horemheb according to the new king lists, and that deleted then Akhenaten and down to Tutankhamun and the successors from history. And it's only then the fact that there are all of these spectacular finds like the tomb of Tutankhamun, finding Amarna, that proved otherwise and undeleted them from history in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so it is just kind of surprising then, like I say, in this thousands of years of swash of history, that some of the most famous Egyptian figures that we think of, everything from Pharaoh regnant queen Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, who's probably or possibly also another regnant pharaoh but is fairly famous, Akhenaten, King Tut, maybe the most famous pharaoh of all because of his fabulous treasures. Ramesses II, also really high on the list. And Ramesses' father, Seti, is also fairly well known because, again, of the modern portrayals of the Moses story. I guess Seti is actually the pharaoh because he's sort of the brother of Moses' adopted mother in all of the stories. He's actually the pharaoh that's portrayed most in movies as a result. So what about Moses then? This, of course, is Moses talking to Ramesses II in the movie The Ten Commandments that I referenced earlier. If we go back again to this time frame and we are zeroing in on this period in the New Kingdom that goes from Akhenaten to Ramesses II, that's also, again, when the rabbis had kind of later suggested maybe Moses will have been around. But the problem here is that that's still this time frame, the 13th century before the Common Era. That's still so many centuries before you get to the Babylonian exile, which is when we're talking about the beginnings of, after the exile is when the Torah, Genesis and Exodus especially, are taking their present form that we have it. That's going to be 800 years or separating that kind of time frame. And even if the earliest sources, as they might be dated, are a little bit before the exile, it's still 700 years or so, before they're separating any historical event, if there was one, a historical figure, Moses, from writing anything down about him, which is a really long time to have such a thing happen or live in oral tradition if that was what it was doing. But there's a bunch of other problems. So nothing like the vast exodus of the population described in the Exodus story can be found in Egyptian records. So we have really a lot of good records for Egypt that go all the way back. The Exodus story claims that the Hebrew slaves were essentially outpopulating the Egyptians in their own land, and so if they were to all leave at a particular moment, this would have had a major effect. That even with the Egyptians always putting a good spin on their own history, they would at minimum say that they kicked all of these slaves out or something like that, and we just don't have anything like that. There's been a desire to maybe see in the actual history of the Hyksos, those invaders, to have them have something to do with this, but it doesn't fit the story as written, and it certainly then doesn't line up because those guys are kicked out before with the founding of the New Kingdom, and so it would be for both Ramesses and the Akhenaten, so it wouldn't have any relation to that. More importantly, like I say, the Exodus story is composed so many centuries after the time of Ramesses. Stories are always composed the author is writing in the context that they know at the time they're writing, not the time they're setting their story, because they don't have that historical background. And so in the New Kingdom especially, this is when Egypt is at its height. And so Ramesses II actually owns all of Canaan and Sinai and so forth. This is the time period when the New Kingdom's empire goes up and is in conflict with the Hittites. At the top of that border layers where they're fighting over things like Kadesh. And so Ramesses fights a big battle at Kadesh with the Hittites, and that's, again, one of these first events in history where we have both the Hittite version of this and the Egyptian version of it. And so it's a time period that's well known. So if the Israelites, if the Exodus story had historicity, and it was to be attached to the Ramesses story, wandering around in Sinai and ending up in Canaan isn't escaping Egypt at all. That you would be still within Egypt dominion. So it's anachronistic. It's not. Doesn't have, therefore, as we've talked about a bunch of different times, the Exodus story as written doesn't have historicity. So what about Moses? Well, the name Moses is a little interesting. The Bible gives Moses' name a folk etymology, which happens all the time in Genesis and Exodus and so on. The Pharaoh's daughter finds the infant Moses in a basket, put it in a basket to save its life from her father's edict. And so she says, because I drew you from the water, I will call you Moses. And so the Semitic root word musha means to draw out. And so this is a folk etymology that the author of Exodus, or the author of this component of Exodus, has given to explain the name Moses and why that name exists. But just because there's a folk etymology that's assigned to it doesn't mean that that's where the name came from or what it means. And some linguists have argued that the name Moses could have the Egyptian root musi, which means child of, as part of like the theophoric names that we have. So we have names like Tutmosa, which means born of Thoth, or Ramosa, born of Ra. And so maybe Mosa here means, it would be like El Mosa, born of El, or Yahweh Mosa, born of Jehomosa, which would be, born of Yahweh. Or maybe he did have a name like an Egyptian god, and that gets edited out because they don't want that. So that's an idea that people have had to try to see the name as having an Egyptian connection. Nevertheless, so while it was undoubtedly true, so people would like to find, let's say, is there a kernel of truth to this story? And so, a vast mass migration from Egypt to Canaan did not happen the way Exodus describes. Did some little tiny group go? Well, certainly some people emigrated from Egypt to Canaan or vice versa. But like I say, there's no historical event on the scale described in Exodus. And so because of that, because of the anachronisms in the story, because of how long before when the story is set to when it's written down, I think we can conclude that the Exodus story is itself mythic, and whether or not there is any actual historical figure named Moses. Again, the stories about him are all written so many centuries after the time in which they're set. They too have to be regarded as mythic. And so therefore, when we are reading the story, people want to have all kinds of naturalistic explanations for mythic events that occur in the story. So there was some kind of the parting of the Red Sea isn't about that happening, or there's a windstorm, or they want to come up with some kind of naturalistic explanation for that. That isn't necessary, because this is not an eyewitness event. You don't have to make Moses going and seeing God with a cloud of fire on Mount Sinai into a volcano like Sigmund Freud had, because again, this is not an eyewitness event. This is a literary story that is created centuries after when it would have been set, and so these are created by authors who are wanting to show divine power, and that's how they understood that to work in antiquity. So finally, in terms of just the idea of Atenism influencing Israelite monotheism, anything like that set in the time of Aten and the mythic time of Moses is itself an anachronism. As we've seen in lectures that we've done on Baal and on Asherah and on the development of Yahwism, the development of the understanding of the development of monotheism, the understanding of God in the Bible, when the Bible portrays as this tribal pre-temple period, the Israelites are not actually monotheists. The Bible pretends they were because it's written anachronistically later, but there are all sorts of footprints and clues that tell us that in fact actually they were regular Canaanite polytheists at the time who worshipped multiple gods like Asherah and Baal and so forth. The Bible even says that. And we certainly find Asherah figurines, for example, in huge numbers in this kind of time period. So monolatry only develops slowly, and especially at the headquarters or at the court in the Jerusalem temple at the very end of the First Temple period. And it really only becomes monotheism as we get into the big biblical writing period. So Second Isaiah and so forth are really asserting a real monotheism in the Second Temple period. And so if Moses was a rogue Atenist, that would itself be an anachronism, which is why he really isn't a vector for bringing this very interesting religious reform, a monolatrous religion that was short-lived in Egypt, but died out without directly influencing centuries later the development of monolatry and ultimately monotheism in Judaism. And so that is my take on whether Akhenaten invented monotheism. And so I'm going to get a glass of water as Leandro starts collecting your questions for me. So again, I want to thank people who are for giving support in the chats here. I want to thank Dave Anderson, Fire Ever Living, Magi Mike, Ted Gemberling, Cliff Fornwalt. Cliff, you also have asked a question about a Wall Street Journal article on YouTube ex-Mormons, and I'm going to. You asked if we could do that in the Let There Be Answers. Well, I'm going to put that in as the first question when we do the Let There Be Answers, since it's off topic for this one. Phil writes, thank you for your support. And Phil writes and asks, in one's writings, would you say that God with a capital G implies the God from the Bible, or could it also be used to refer to any supreme God concept? So I would use it to refer to any supreme God concept. I don't think it has to be God from the Bible. And so I would also use it for the God with a capital G to refer to a bunch of the, the Greco-Roman monist philosophies, theologies. So as they develop, there's a supreme God, a single source in Neoplatonism and also in Stoicism, even though they have very different ideas of it. I think that I would use the capital G God for both of those, as well as for the biblical supreme God concept. Anders and Alistair, thank you for your support. Per this Song of Ra, when it says, lives on the right, does right mean correct or just, or is it like left and right? And if the latter, why and what? So again, I unfortunately don't know Egyptian, but we've looked that up, and it's possible in Egyptian texts that right often connotes both a direction, being on the right-hand side or the east side, but it also can denote righteousness and strength. And I guess I guess we have that in. Now we have politics and right and left, which is different. But there is in right-handed stuff was seen as left-handed stuff is sinister in Latin, whereas right-handed stuff is dexterous. So it's possible that like that kind of a thing. What I would say here is that I think if the right bank, it's I guess is the idea of the east bank, although that's how we would be looking at it from our maps. So anyway, I don't know in this particular case in this hymn for sure. And I guess what it would potentially mean is it might be on the right and left bank of the river, but it also could mean right in terms of righteousness is what it possibly means. Michael Luce says, did Neoplatonism, did Plotinus reference Atenism in their higher unique God depiction? No, I don't think so, because the issue is that Atenism was successfully deleted. So we don't have this idea being able to be remembered. It's not that there are no, it didn't cause any changes, but the theology itself gets suppressed by the Ramessids as they restore the worship of the old gods. And like I say, Amun and the priesthood end up becoming incredibly powerful again. And so I don't think that, so Plotinus doesn't have it in the records in order to reference it. So it's an experiment that, if he did invent monolatry even, it's not an invention that got invented again, as opposed to one that had any continuity from this original one. Nathan Gale says, a lot of Christians, usually Protestants, accuse others of being polytheists, and it's usually meant as an insult. So for example, Protestants say that about Mormonism. How do we destigmatize polytheism? Yeah, so I'm very much try to do that, and it's hard because just even the word polytheist is itself an idea from the, it's again using monotheist lenses. Polytheists didn't go around saying that they were polytheists until monotheists came up with monotheism and then started using that to describe non-monotheists. And the same thing is true with the traditional word pagan, which begins as a name of aspersion. It means, the Hicks, the stick, people from the sticks, the yokels. And so I guess the way I work on it in terms of in language, I often say, instead of saying polytheist, I often say the traditional religion, or I say the worship of the old gods. So I try to bring those kind of phrases in, although then I sometimes also say pagan and polytheist so that we understand what we're talking about. But by giving, in religion, often antiquity and priority are privileged, and so the fact that it's the old way is often seen as more legitimate in religion than something that's a new thing. And so I think by connecting polytheism or connecting this kind of religion, with the continuity of the earlier tradition, gives it maybe the place of privilege, which is maybe somewhat destigmatizing. So I certainly try to do that. Fire Ever Living says, why was polytheism the default such that monotheism needed to be invented? One God always seems to me to be more simpler than many gods. So I think that the reason why is that it's all inherited from prehistory. So it is not it's not something that within history, within civilization, gets invented, and so we have to actually look for we have to look within pre-literate societies that are animist and things like that to try to extrapolate what comes before or how polytheism evolves. But essentially, I think one of the things that happens is that there are all kinds of local competing centers of authority. There are all kinds of chaotic things that exist in your life, and they don't all seem to be operating according to one big plan. And the way that people start to come up with like one big plan, monotheism, is when you start to get a big empire and you start to have a big monarch, and then the big monarch wants to say, no, the heaven is like this kingdom. There is one ruler and there's one source, and we see that when we look at how things work in heaven.
Sometimes it will echo your royal court, and so the bigger your royal court, sometimes the big in your empire, the bigger the pantheon. Yeah,
exactly. So this is why I think these things especially then take off once we have the great world empires, right? And so the Persian Empire is sometimes credited as kind of like biggest important early world empire, and it also is a source of what is sometimes thought of as the first world religion, Zoroastrianism, and these ideas continue in Rome and successor empires. Ted Gemberling says, could Yakuber and Yakobam, Hyksos kings, be related to Jacob? So I think that this is an example of where names sound superficially similar in English, but I don't necessarily have any relationship to how Jacob works. But we would have to look at, the exact. I mean, I haven't done a listing of the Hyksos kings, but I would say it's not likely. Off-topic questions. Let's see. Laurent says, how was Egypt viewed by ancient Hebrews, a place of servitude in the Exodus story or safe haven for Abraham, Jeremiah, Joseph, and Mary? Does John have some elements on this contradiction? So when you are living in Canaan, if you're living in anywhere in greater, the Syria there, the Levant, you inevitably can't help but think of the two greater empires that are on either side of you, because Canaan, Syria, and the Levant essentially is a smaller zone in terms of how much population and stability and wealth that you can have in Egypt and how much you can have in Mesopotamia. And so the ancient Hebrews are aware of both of these ancient centers, and they're also aware of the traditions of incredible antiquity that both of them have. So the Egyptians, their tradition, they're very, very conservative people, and it goes all the way back, very, very long time, to the point where nobody, by the time they're around, nobody even really has any sense of, the building of the pyramids or anything like that, which are already so many, centuries and centuries old. Likewise, the antiquity of Mesopotamian civilization and ruins that go back to the Sumerians, and so they're aware of those as cradles of civilization, which is why the Bible contains origin myths that include both places from either side. So the children of Israel come out of Egypt in the Exodus story. Abraham comes out of Chaldea in the Abraham story. So in other words, both of these origin myths are created because they're aware of these kind of two great powerful civilizations on either side of them. So it depends on when you're talking about. So there are always factions in the First Temple period where maybe people in the court would like to make an alliance with the pharaoh, and there's other people who would want to make an alliance with whatever the Mesopotamian power is, whether it's Assyria or later Babylon. And ultimately they make the biggest alliance they have. They end up liking the Persians a lot, and not liking as much the Hellenistic leaders, especially the Seleucids. And so, I don't know, Egypt takes on different views at different times, and it ultimately is in the time period of Jesus, it emerges as the biggest location of a diaspora Jewish population. So Alexandria and Egypt have more practicing Judean adherents than will exist in Jerusalem because of how big the population is. And so that's probably why there are contradictory views of it. Patty O'Reilly says, Simcha Jacobici in the documentary The Exodus Decoded proposed that Pharaoh Ahmose was the pharaoh of the Exodus, and that his name means brother of Moses in Hebrew. So where does he fit in? So I haven't seen that. So unfortunately, not everything you have on the History Channel is great. But anyway, what I would say is that Ahmose here is not doesn't a Hebrew name, so this is going to be one of these theophoric Egyptian names, since it's an Egyptian pharaoh, and what that means is it's going to mean like child of awe, whatever, so that a different god than that, as opposed to brother of Moses. So I would have to look at where that is and what it would mean, but I would say that the Exodus as written doesn't fit anywhere into Egyptian history. And again, because it is written so many centuries after when it was set, we just would be best to think of it as entirely mythic. K. Tempest Bradford asks, my only question is, can we see Yul Brynner again? Well, hopefully maybe we'll be able to do, we're going to do maybe another one of these movie reviews. We did the Mel Gibson movie, but I would much rather see any movie that has Yul Brynner in it. so it'd be fun for us to try one of those. So thank you so much. I want to remind everybody about the newsletter. Please go to the website and subscribe. And next week, we're finally going to get back to the lecture we tried to give a couple weeks ago, Will Christianity Survive the 21st Century? And don't forget to send in your questions for Let There Be Answers.